Aron Pilhofer, a warm welcome to you. You're a keen yachtsman. You've been on an America's Cup yacht recently. And that idea of sailing close to the wind, very similar theme with journalism. The pace of change is immense. You're almost in the eye of the storm, even as we speak, such is the pace of it. How do you handle kind of keeping going when all that turmoil is going on around you?
I don't know that it feels quite that dramatic, but you know, it has been interesting in just the 5 years. You know, at the New York Times, I came there as a reporter in 2005, and it was a fairly, even at that time, it was a fairly traditional print newsroom. At that time, the digital newsroom was not just a separate operation, it was in a separate building. Integration had just begun. And so, you know, even in just those few years, since 2005, the change has just been, you would not even recognize the place now.
So is that to say you still take pride in this being a profession, one that still has all the hallmarks of what you joined from day one?
Oh no, it absolutely is. Everything we do is journalism. We're absolutely proud of the journalism we do. And the team that I run, even though many of them have never, you know, maybe the New York Times is the first newsroom they've ever been in. I think what you're seeing is a redefinition of what a journalist is, what sorts of tools we can bring to bear, and in particular, like adopting more sort of digital approaches to storytelling and to news gathering. I think those are the biggest changes I've seen.
You talked about that distinction between digital being in one building and everyone else there. What was the tipping point that brought things together?
You know, I'm not really sure that there was any single moment, but I think there was a sort of collective, there certainly was a decision on the part of the masthead editors at the Times that it was necessary to begin to merge. We were one of the early, one of the very first, certainly of the large newsrooms, we were one of the first to integrate the web and the print newsroom. So, you know, what went into that decision, that happened before I arrived, but I'm glad it was made back then, because it's a long process. I wouldn't even say it's completed. It's an ongoing sort of evolution, and where we are now is really unrecognizable from where we were.
One of those changes seems to be the divide between the press and the consumer. Hitherto a bit like the church in the Gutenberg press. He who held the press and the right to print had all the power. With that having disintegrated, what does it say about respect for this as an industry? One of those institutions of society?
I think it's absolutely essential, and it makes our role, I think, more vital than it ever has been. Because there is now so much information. Information is absolutely ubiquitous. The problem isn't a lack of information. The problem is a lack of filter, of editing, of journalists taking ownership and understanding a story. So the big change for us, I think, has been to sort of not just be the voice of God, which has been sort of the traditional approach, but rather to selectively and strategically bring readers into the reporting process when it makes sense, to try to be a little bit more two-way with readers, but always understanding that we have a role, a critical role in editing and presenting, reporting news in the way we always have.
One of the challenges playing out even in this market seems to be getting through to entrenched views even around a boardroom table, such that you need a Mark Zuckerberg equivalent there to shake things up. Now, does that exist around the board of the NYT? If not, why not?
Well, we do actually. Joe Ito, who runs the MIT Media Lab, actually just joined our board this year. So there are actually some fairly very progressive digital thinkers that are now part of the New York Times board. But we're also very lucky to have a chairman, CEO, or sorry, chairman in Arthur Sulzberger, who himself has absolutely embraced our digital future. He has in recent past made news by saying things like, you know, there may not be a printed New York Times in 5 years, you know, and he did it to sort of stir up a little bit of controversy.
And yet surely the ad market's saying that where once you might have been peripheral, now you're the gatekeeper, you're front and center, you're where it's at.
Well, I think we've seen a gradual shift in that direction. I think you're seeing as print advertising goes down, digital advertising is moving up, not in anywhere near the amount that would replace it ultimately. I think that's what the biggest issue is for everybody. But yeah, I think that's exactly, and by the way, I think that's what our readers are telling us. I mean, with our paywall, you're seeing, you know, 500,000, more than 500,000 digital-only subscribers. That's pretty remarkable. I was not necessarily the biggest supporter of the paywall before it came in. Not that anybody cared what I thought, but it's done really, really well.
You took it down during Hurricane Sandy. How do you then put it back up once you've lured people in your front door, invited them to stay, and then said, well, thanks, but only for a limited time?
Our paywall is a little bit different than some of the other paywalls. It's not a hard wall, so it always provides a certain amount of access. The homepage is always free. It's always open. You get 10 article views per month. But I think the decision was a good one, and it was made both by the newsroom and the business side, that in a case like that, we are serving a public service, and that lowering the paywall at that point was the right move. We also did it on election night, by the way.
What's being tested here, it would seem, as much as any other market now, is inviting a reader in on a service, so they're paying to access articles, but then the comments they might leave are causing offence, with courts saying, as publisher, buck ultimately stops with you. How are we going to strike a balance in that whole conundrum?
But that's what a paywall is about, right? I mean, there is going to be a line drawn, and I think that was the decision that they made, that knowing that there were going to be people that hit that limit and said, well, you know.
But more, if somebody is able to get into the system because they're subscribing, they then choose to leave comments that cast aspersions on others. How do you accommodate that? They're part of the community.
Right.
You're taking their money, they're embracing the service, but they feel a freedom to maybe overstep the mark.
We take a very different approach to comment than many U.S. News sites. We actually pre-moderate everything and always have. So, we have very high editorial standards. Our comment moderators are actually very experienced journalists, and we make real substantial decisions on what comments we allow through. So the kinds of comments you're talking about, actually you won't see on the New York Times. So it's not as big a problem for us. But the situation you are describing is absolutely visible on other sites.
Executive Mark Thompson hails from the BBC, a firestorm for that once, I suppose, untouchable organisation when it comes to circulating allegations of paedophilia around a former Tory MP. He's denied them, and yet the Twitter sphere has picked up on that and dragged users equally into that firestorm. The moral being, if you are a user, don't think you can say what you want because you will be liable. Are you comfortable with latest developments?
But, I mean, I don't know that that's any different from any other form of publishing, right? I mean, if you say something defamatory or otherwise, you can be held responsible for that by a court. So, I think it's a really interesting case in particular here.
It's interesting also because employees of news organisations are having their own accounts and purporting on the one hand to be independent, but also represent the organisation.
Right.
So are you seeing the lines being blurred there? Do you
Absolutely. We encourage our reporters. We have a very, very, very liberal policy around social media, and we absolutely support, promote, encourage our reporters to tweet, to be out there, to talk, sensibly. We have seen cases where some reporters have gone a bit over the line, nothing super egregious, but I think in the end it benefits the news organization because of what you're saying, that they are perceived, Brian Stelter, David Carr, they're perceived as part of the Times as much as they are themselves. So I think in the end everybody wins.
Let's talk the US election. 25,000 tweets a minute, and some would say that was information overload. So actually who triumphed?
One was Nate Silver, that's who won.
All right, because?
Because he got it right, again. Right. That's who really won. But
and what's the secret to getting it right?
In this case, it was his secret sauce.
Yeah, they always say secret sauce, but what is it? Because actually no one's been able to tell me the ingredients.
Right. Well, that's why Nate Silver is Nate Silver, is that his model, you got to see the result of that, but his model was right on. And it was pretty extraordinary because he was under enormous pressure. I mean, you have no idea. There was a lot of people the day after. If he had gotten it wrong, there were a lot of people lined up to take a piece of flesh out of Nate Silver. So
dust settles on all of that, people will agree that it was great at disseminating and curating material, but ultimately the traditional networks, TV, radio, newspapers won the day. Fair comment?
I think so. I mean, I think what you saw this year in particular on some of the old traditional news sites like LA Times and some of the new ones, by the way. I mean, the Huffington Post, I think, did some of the best work of any news site on election night. They did some terrific reporting, and they did some amazing infographics. So I think you're seeing a mix. But yeah, by far, I think that night it was a traditional media.
And yet you had mainstays hitherto, like Newsweek, no longer covering wall-to-wall the campaign. There just simply isn't the budget for it. So when you reflect on all that, what have we lost as a profession, as a craft, as a service for our audience?
Well, I think you've seen a lot of all the news magazines have really lost their way, and Newsweek among them. It's hard to say what we've lost in that sense, but I do think there is a trade-off. And all the immediacy, you want immediate analysis. You don't want to have to wait a week, to read about this.
And yet, do you sense, that there's still an appetite for long-form investigative journalism, the type where a whole unit might spend a year going off on a tangent and not come back with the bacon? I mean, frankly, are there the budgets alongside the will to do that?
Not at all. In fact, I actually think that investigative reporting is, in some ways, better off than it ever has been. Yeah, we, as the New York Times, have continued our investment in investigative reporting. That unit continues to do great work. It hasn't shrunk at all. But then you have outfits like ProPublica that have, come up in the recent years. They're doing terrific work. They've won Pulitzer Prizes. I mean, you really are you're starting to see other forms of investigative reporting.
And yet, how did it all go so wrong at the BBC? You had an investigative unit working alongside journalists, and it all somehow turned to Custard.
Boy, I don't know. I am certainly not the one to say, but it is really sad to see, as a longtime fan of the BBC, and in particular of Newsnight, it's hard to watch. It's hard to watch.
You've been here all of 48 hours. I suppose you're going to give me the pat, it's all fine on the Western Front when we talk the health of the industry here, or correct me otherwise.
Yeah, so obviously I'm in perfect position to comment intelligently on this. Yeah. But no, I mean, you obviously have still a vibrant newspaper market, which is impressive. Obviously, you're facing the same kinds of pressures that the U.S. is facing, the U.K. is facing, and I think it's very interesting to see some of the approaches. You're seeing the paywall question on the News Limited side, and then Fairfax talking about going very, very much to the digital side, more than most. And it's very interesting to see what's going on down here. I'll be intrigued to see 3-4 years from now where things stand. What
do you see as the biggest challenge, finally, Aron, for the industry in the round inside the next 12 months?
Boy, there's so many. I mean, to me, it still comes down to open records and availability of data, and in particular data. That's sort of my thing. And I think when you don't keep pressing for freedom of information, and we don't use the laws that exist, and you don't keep insisting that, no, these are the public's records and we have a right to see them, and as do they, then I think ultimately you end up losing.
All the poorer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aron. Appreciate your insights.